Okay, so
Should I
you.
start talking, or
Yep, yep. We're back on.
back on?
Pardon the brief interruption there. So you were talking about your dad, and he had a very influential position
Right.
with the government there in Germany, and um, and what? How about uh, three adjectives that you would use to describe your father?
Um, Smart,
Mm-hmm.
um, um, gifted, and caring.
Gifted and caring.
I think he really cared about his wife
Uh huh.
and his two daughters. It was very obvious that he loved us dearly. So that's always a good thing to grow up with.
Yeah, have a loving home, of course. And what about family values? Were there things between your dad and your mom that they established that were guidelines for your family and you and your sister growing up?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think set us apart was the fact that our parents were a lot older than most contemporaries of my that I knew in my life,
Mm-hmm.
and I always worried about the fact that I had these fusty old people with white hair and dowdy house dresses. But whereas my friends had these smart moms with nifty little outfits and red tennis shoes. So I always thought, any minute one of them's going to die, which actually became truth when my mom died earlier than we had hoped. And
Yeah. And what was she like? You had how old were you when she passed away?
I was 17 when she died, and that's when
17.
my domestic gene kicked in because I automatically assumed that it was now my job to uphold her position,
Uh-huh.
that I would become, in a sense, the mom
Mm-hmm.
and do all the domestic things that moms did, like scrub floors and wash windows and cook meals and can tomatoes and um, sew the curtains and upholster the furniture and all those
Yeah.
myriad responsibilities that
Yeah.
moms have.
Yeah.
But as a whole, I think we had a very nice, stable family. I think my parents genuinely loved one another, and especially my dad more so than my mom. I always felt, but they were there for us, and they would, all I had to do was ask, and the check would come in the mail. In
Yeah.
those days when we still had to write checks.
Yeah. Well, when so your mom, you mentioned she passed away while you were young, but in the years that you remember her before she fell ill, what was she like? What were how would you describe her?
She was a very quiet person,
Mm-hmm.
I and I guess kind of.
Introverted, would you say, or just
I'm sorry.
introverted, or
I
just
guess, yeah,
yeah.
maybe a little bit on the introvert. I always felt that my dad really loved my mom, and that but that it was not a passionate kind of love. It was just a abiding kind of love where you knew you had someone that you could depend on to get you through.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, when she died, that was in those days when people didn't feel they had to inform the kids about things that were going on in their lives, like their mother
Mm-hmm.
dying, because
Right.
nobody ever mentioned it to us until like the day she died
Oh my
that
goodness.
that she was ill. And I look at pictures and I know that she was already sick,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the pictures that were floating around, and um, but it never occurred to our dad to take us aside and say, okay, here's what's happening. Your
Yeah.
mom is very sick, and she might leave us, and see if we could bolster the sadness a little bit.
Yeah.
But um, but yeah, she died of lung cancer, and it went very quickly towards the end.
Mm.
But but she was just a very gentle person.
Yeah.
She had a good sense of humor, and I'm told by my sister that she was actually a fashion model at one point
Oh.
in her youth, which is one of those little details that somewhere I never picked up on.
Huh.
But yeah, she was a nifty lady, and not a smart dresser, because if she had a sense of clothing, she would have been a knockout. Mm-hmm. She was a very beautiful woman.
So, but it sounds like a little bit like there's a theme of things, really that the adults in your life growing up didn't share things with you. I mean, important facts that, for instance, that you were adopted, and then also that your mom was sick for a while before she passed away, which must have seemed very sudden to you.
Well, we moved to Annapolis just because she liked the town.
Yeah.
We uprooted the family, and we all moved to Annapolis for no other reason than she liked it there. Uh-huh. But that was also where she died, so at least she was in good surroundings. Yeah. But yeah, I feel basically that I've always been the kind of a loner, even as a kid, mm-hmm. and that I kind of raised myself. And it occurred to me that my mom was dead, so that means I had to learn to cook, and it was very clear. And it's sort of a repeating refrain in my life. Step in and just start doing it by myself in most cases.
Okay, so that.
Yeah, because my parents, I guess, they were busy. I think parents are just much more interactive now than they were back in the 30s and the 40s. Mm-hmm. Interactive in the sense of communicating with their kids and having a dialogue between yourself and your children.
Yeah. Well, and as you mentioned, that sometimes that's sort of a sign of the times. Maybe that's a little bit what was done in that era, and maybe people are more forthcoming now. But what about if you think back as far as you can remember, so maybe age 4 or 5, and describe a situation that you can remember. So one of your early.
The one that popped into my mind just automatically when you were saying your question is when I was about that age, maybe 4, mm-hmm. and we were living in Munich, Germany, in an apartment house that that belonged to friends of my parents, and our house had been bombed, and so we had moved in with them for a temporary period of time, just because we needed a roof over our head until my dad could find a new dwelling and get things moved and deal with the results of having your house bombed. Mm-hmm. But we were living with these people. Their name was Reisert, I remember, and they were good friends of my mother and father, and they were also doctors, and they had this amazing apartment that had a polar bear rug of once a real polar bear that was now a rug, mm-hmm. and I found that to be totally fascinating. But the memory that most sticks with me is one day, there was a courtyard in the back, in the middle of these apartment buildings, mm-hmm. and the children were out playing, and there were in many cases children in those days in affluent families had nannies, so the children were playing with it, and the nannies were out watching. Mm-hmm. And one of the children drowned in the pool that was at the back of in this little park, and it was floating face down in the water.
The child, and you saw that happen?
And yes, and I always think about that, just that one instant flash of people realizing that the baby had died, and it was just a baby. It was just a very small person, and and the thing too that was floating next to the baby was a white pencil. I don't know what that means, but I that sticks in my mind.
Yes. And that must have been very upsetting. Did you talk to your parents about that, or
probably not? I don't think anybody sat down and explained the facts of life in terms of death and and attendant things. Yeah. But it was just never. I don't think anybody ever mentioned it again. I think that the nanny probably picked me up and took me back to the apartment. While the authorities were dealing with, the body and however people dealt with it in those days. But that made a very profound impression on me.
Sure, I can see why. Do you remember if you made sort of what you decided about what had happened? What did you? I mean, how old do you think you were when that happened?
I was probably 3 or 4. It was before we moved out into the country. We were in, let's see, I was in the 5th grade. And it's counting back about.
So you were very small, and
I was probably about 3 to 4 in there. But then we moved into Schlagenhofen. That would make me 5, and then we moved to Landshut. It would make me 6 or 7.
So
and then
this
at 8,
definitely
we
happened
came to the States.
before you were 5. It sounds like. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, I think that's not unusual. I mean, it's unusual to remember things much before the age of 4, but in that case, something that traumatic, I could see why you'd remember that. But do you remember if you, what you might have concluded about that, or if you?
I don't think I had any, nothing to compare it to.
Yeah.
I'd never seen anything dead before.
Sure.
I probably thought that was an inanimate person, like a doll or something that was floating in the water.
So that it seemed very surreal, or.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that you didn't realize how surreal until it was many years later. But it always comes into my mind as part of that period that we lived in Munich, with bombings all around us every day.
Wow. Is there, so that is a very significant memory then. Is there something maybe around that age, or maybe, just another early childhood, remembrance that you have?
Another one?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the next one that comes into mind also, strangely enough, has to do with death. I must have been preoccupied with death or something. It seems like there's a lot of memories that bring that into the topic. But I was in Germany again with my mother, and we were out in the country, and I think we were on a bicycle, because she had one of those bicycles with a clip at the end where you could attach packages. Except I had to sit on it because I was the passenger on her bicycle, and it pinched. But we came to a little chapel, and it was one of those beautiful Bavarian chapels with the onion dome and the blue sky and the cows in the meadow and the sheep in the corn. It was just this beautiful, typically Bavarian kind of picture. And we walked into this little church. And at the front of the church was a casket with a man lying in it. And I asked my mother what that was, and she said, "The man has gone to heaven." And I said, "No, he hasn't. He's right there." Which, that didn't make sense to me. How could he be in heaven and be on the earth at the same time?
Right.
But anyway, so that's my second little vignette.
Wow, yeah.
About childhood memories. There must be some happier ones there as well somewhere.
Well, and I'm sure there were, but it's sometimes, I appreciate you just sharing what comes to mind. And I wonder if does it seem to you there's a theme a little bit about somewhat of who you are today and how you are today is related to the things that you learned and experienced when you were that little girl growing up in Germany?
Yeah.
That sense of
serious child.
There's the seriousness, but also what you mentioned about the older, the adults in your life not necessarily explaining things to you. So this feeling of kind of being left in the dark a lot, maybe, and
trying to figure things out by yourself.
Yeah, which carries through to, you described yourself as a loner today. That might be connected. I don't know. Does that?
Yeah, but by the same token, I don't. It's not that I don't have friends, or I have a lot of very wonderful friends and a great family. So I'm not locked into my chamber by myself all day long every day. I spend a lot of time with people, and I enjoy being with them, and I make friends pretty easily. So the loneliness is tempered by. Um,
Well, and so you've channeled those experiences and brought them with you, but you've also found ways to um, make another way for yourself now.
mm-hmm.
I mean that is part of we all bring that with us from those things that happened to us in our childhood,
Right. Yeah.
and you seem to be dealing with it in very positive ways now. So,
Well, I try.
mm-hmm.
I try.
Well,
And basically, I'm a happy person.
yeah.
I don't feel like I'm unhappy. It doesn't mean that I don't have my days where bah humbug,
Mm-hmm.
but and I look forward to each day and try to make the most of it, and always find something good in each of those days, just even if it's small.
Yeah. So I also see from the notes you've got some kind of big medical things coming up. But if we fast forward, we're going to assume that that's all going to go well, and in 1 year from today, roughly, just a kind of the general future. What do you think? How do you see happiness, or how do you see how you'd like to be in the world and in the
Well,
short
I'd like
term?
to have my family around me that I have now.
Mm-hmm.
5 years wiser, but still the same people,
Mm-hmm.
and sharing our experiences and living close enough together so that we can get even just an occasional glimpse. But yeah, and I see myself as being a great artist. I'm going to finally get rid of my painter's block and get back to painting, and I think that is like an avenue of escape in some ways, but it's also an avenue for enrichment and the people that you meet and the successes that you have.
Well, thank you for sharing these thoughts and feelings with me, and I'll look forward to meeting with you again in the future.
Yeah, I would look forward to seeing you too.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.